Hey guys, this is Keiko2000, or Book Talk with Keiko, actually, on this channel. And I wanted to say a couple things. This is going to be episode 2 of reading Flight to Freedom. Now, I am redoing this because the last one, there were some complications and editing errors that I couldn't fix. So we're rereading this. And it's going to be on chapter 2. So if you want to see chapter 1 or listen to chapter 1, then go to that. So I'm just trying to make sure you guys can see me straight in the face. And hopefully my lighting's okay. I tried to check it as much as possible, but you know how it is, guys. Or maybe you don't, but maybe one day you will know how it is. That being said, this is going to be no edit. Even if I stutter a lot. Actually, I'll probably edit it if I stutter a lot. Sorry. Also, I'm making a new channel. It's going to be a reconstruction channel, and this is my 5th channel. So I know I have a lot of channels, guys, but bear with me. This channel, the new channel is going to be me doing reconstructions of different buildings, like the Claudia Aqueduct. I've already done that. The Colosseum. And just more and more skyscrapers, cities, Rome, the whole Rome, everything that was important to the Roman society, everything that was important to the Egyptian society, Greek, Asian, Indian, on, American, and just a bunch of reconstructions. Also on that channel, I'll be doing reviews on like the Yonana, maybe lanterns, tripods, which is what you guys are on, different books. So if you want to see reviews after we finish a book on that, then you guys can go to that channel and see my review on how much I liked the book or what I thought about it. But I'm probably going to keep the book reviews for the most part on this channel, unless I really think it needs to be spread. Alright, let's skip to chapter 2. Again, so I've already read this, but we're going to reread it for you guys. And sorry if you're screaming in the background, the Steeler game's going on right now, but I wanted to make a video for y'all. Alright, let's do this. Chapter 2, Chains of Slavery, is the right phrase. No one was free and independent where slavery existed. There were 11 million people in the South. Of these, only 350,000 held slaves. The rest, 4 million Negroes and more than 6.5 million slaves who were white, were chained to slavery. The Negroes were owned body and soul. The slaveless whites were bound economically, as we shall see. Almost all the 6.5 million slaves, whites were desperately poor and could do little to change their condition. Now, guys, when I was reading this the first time, I didn't really understand what that meant. It's saying that 500,000 people who were white were also slaves, but slaves to their society. They weren't bound like the black people, so they weren't like whipped and everything, but they were still slaves of their own country. The reason for this lay in the psychological of slavery. Factories and industry, where men might have taken jobs, were practically non-existent in the South. Cotton ruled everything. The poor white had no way in which to buy large tracts of land, which alone made the growing of cotton economical. With the exception of some rice growing along the seacoast, cotton was the only large crop of the South. Yet cotton wears out the soil quicker than almost any other crop. Only the large plantations could afford to let some of their land lie fallow and still have a large enough crop for profit. If the poor white tried growing small patches of cotton, and he persistently did, he was in hopeless competition with the big cotton growers. Any serious efforts to introduce new crops and rotate them with cotton rain into such determined opposition from the large planters that they came to nothing. Politically and societally and morally, the 350,000 slave owners dominated the South. Southern churches preached regular sermons saying that God approved of slavery. Southern newspapers printed nothing unfriendly to slavery. Southern legislators took great care that only laws favorable to slavery was passed. It was a vicious cycle. In an economy that depended on debased and enslaved labor, a white man could not work with his hands. In the field, for a white man not to assume his own mind and in the mind of an employer some of the some of the traits of a slave. This was, of course, nonsense, but a nonsense that was believed and truly, truly believed. Because of this, even overseers, so indispensable on a large plantation, were usually drawn from the Northerns or from the lowest white groups of the South. Just before the Civil War, a book created a tremendous stir and became famous. It was called The Impending Crisis in the South and was written by a non-slaveholding North Carolina man named H.R. Helper. This is what he said, and it's worth reading carefully because few denied his correctness at the time it appeared. So this is what he said, guys. I still feel like I'm out of the shot. So this is what he said. For the last 60 years, slaveholders have been the constant representatives of the South. And what have they accomplished? We point to our thinly inhabited states, to our fields stripped of their virgin soil, to the despicable price of lands, to our unvisited cities and towns, to our ancient harbors and idle water power, to the dreary essence of shipping and manufacturers, to millions of living monuments of ignorance, to squalid poverty of the whites, and to utter wretchedness of the blacks. Notwithstanding the fact that they are non-slaveholders of the South are in the majority, 6-1. They have never yet had an uncontrolled part of the framing the laws under which they live. There is no legislation except for the benefit of slavery and slaveholders. As a general rule, poor white persons are regarded with less esteem and attention than Negroes, and though the condition of the latter is wretched beyond description, vast numbers of former are infinitely worse off. To all intents and purposes, they are disfranchised and outlawed, and the only privilege extended is a narrow and circumscribed participant in the political movements that usher slaveholders into office. So, he's saying, like, what's the point of slavery? It's not benefiting anyone, and people of, who are part of the society are just as much as slaves as the black people who are being held into this slavery. Helper created a sensation. He had to escape from North Carolina before a lynch mob, but his facts were never seriously disputed. A lynch is like, a lynch mob is a mob of people who go and try to cut off someone's head or, kill them in painful ways and harsh, inhumane ways. And none of these events happened overnight. The first chain had been fastened by the invention of the cotton gin, and the final chains by the invention in England of a spinning machine and a weaving machine that made cotton goods cheaply available to the whole world. All the cotton that the South could produce was fed into these machines, into similar machines in the North, and thus brought prosperity to a great many men. Cheap labor for picking, ginning, balling, and transporting cotton was now essential, and the cheapest labor of all was the slave. There was nothing wrong about prosperity for the South. All that was wrong was the assumption that slave labor produced it more efficiently. Eventually, the North, with its industrial development and waves of immigration, was to prove to the South that its way to prosperity was better in every sense of the word. When this happened, the two sections of the country stood on the edge of a civil war. Slavery was not chained to the country without many protests. When our Constitution was being prepared, men like Benjamin Franklin, Patrick Henry, and Thomas Jefferson did all they could to include a demarcation of slavery. Sorry if you guys hear that ringing, phone's going off. Just ignore that, please. Wait, it has one more ring left. Let's listen. Yeah, one more. Okay, that's it, I think. Let's try to find this again. Okay. In the end, they were obliged to compromise on something more general. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unavailable rights. Rights that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All men, and then it goes on, but it doesn't say anything, just the ... In addition, they wrote into the Constitution a ruling that by 1807 the slave trade should come to an end. But when 1807 arrived, cotton planters did not want their supply of cheap labor cut off. Alright guys, we're back. A simple way around the constitutional requirement was found. The law forbidding the slave trade was passed and promptly forgotten. Slave smuggling became so profitable that the master of a slave ship sailing the Atlantic from Africa to the United States could permit 9 slaves out of the 10 to die from neglect and still lose no money at all. Humane men were deeply shocked. They protested, and then they did more than protest. They helped the Negro. A large number of these men and women were Quakers, or people with religious conviction that slavery was against the will of God. They found that the slave had been protesting for many long years, and all they had to do was hold out a hand and a runaway would grasp it. Negroes had been showing their contempt for slavery from the first moment they had landed in America. In 1526, when Spanish explorers landed with Negro slaves in what is now South Carolina, the first armed Negro uprising took place. The newspapers and the law courts of the South showed that over 200 revolts and uprisings, carefully planned and carried out by slaves, took place in the 18th century, in the 18th and 19th centuries, and the runaways' line of escape ran its winding course through every state from Alabama to the Canadian border. These escape routes were well chosen from practical reasons. The first goal, in most cases, were either Ohio or Pennsylvania. Those slaves from the deep South who could stow away on a Mississippi riverboat might, with good luck, find themselves on the Ohio River. Ohio had been settled by New Englanders in the southern part and by Southerns in the southern part. But many of these Southerns were men and women who had left their homes because they hated slavery, and the fugitive found helpers at almost any point along the shore. As we have seen with our friend Jeb, he would be passed from house to house until, in the early days, he reached the wilderness of central and western Ohio, where the Octawan Indians gave him assistance. From there, he could be sent into the Western Reserve, where the pioneer town of Hudson, Ohio, was being made into a solid anti-slavery stronghold by men like Owen Brown and his son, John. Or he might go through the Firelands in northwestern Ohio, where men were willing to dare anything for a fugitive. All the routes led to the Great Lakes, and the final task was to conceal the runaway on a sailing boat or send him by the way of a buffalo in Niagara into Canada. Next in importance to Ohio, or perhaps equal to it, was Pennsylvania, and the runaways coming from Virginia and North Carolina found in the Quakers quick and ready friends who would hurry them into the northwest tip of the state from which the final plunge could be taken. Whether the escape route lay through Ohio or Pennsylvania or India or New England, the goal was Canada. It is true that many fugitives went no farther than New York or Boston, where they got work and settled down to live as free men. But there were no real safety south of the Canadian border. Canada was no haven of milk and honey. The Negro suffered hardships that may have been made often wondering whether he had merely exchanged one wretched life for another. A cruel climate, a desolate wilderness from which homes must be wrung, loneliness, yet so few returned to him to the warm and cozy land of slavery that was returned with a master of open-mouthed amazement. In Canada, in spite of physical sufferings, the Negro found safety, opportunity, and self-respect. The men and women who helped the runaway slave knew the risk they were taking. They knew that they had to do everything humanly possible to make sure that no escape failed. The risks were very great. For in 1793, a fugitive slave law had been passed, which put the fugitive at the mercy of any circuit judge or state magistrate who could decide on whether evidence he chose to send him back to slavery. The law also fined anyone who hid a runaway slave $500. And guys, $500 may not seem like a lot, but it was a lot back then. For the sake of both slave and friend, an escape had to be successful. It was a miracle how often escapes did succeed. To the Quakers, breaking the law was a grievous matter. In order to quiet their conscience, they juggled with the truth. The letter of the law was never broken by them, but it was found itself in many strange shapes. John and Mary Smith, for example, Quakers in the southern part of Pennsylvania, showed how much a problem could be handled. Two women fugitives appealed to them for protection. The slave catcher was close behind them, and not a moment could be lost. Without a word, Mary drew the woman into the house, and John stationed himself by the door, taking the woman into the bedroom. Mary lifted the mattress off the bed and told them to lie flat on the ropes. She then replaced the mattress, made up the bed again, and smoothed the counterpane so that not a wrinkle betrayed a hiding place. John, meanwhile, was having a hard time to control not only his temper, but the slave catchers who were demanding the right to search the house. His Quaker principles of non-resistance were being put to a hard test when his wife appeared in the doorway and said, "Let them come in, John. Thee knows there are no slaves here." She spoke the truth. To the Quaker, no such creature as a slave existed. So basically what happened is these two fugitives, who were both women, came into the house and their slave catchers were close behind. Came in the house, this couple took them in and hid them under a mattress. So put them in the bed, put the mattress over, covers and everything. Nothing was showing, just like a regular bed. I think they even might have had a compartment there in case something like this happened. And the slave catchers were demanding to come in, but the husband was like saying, no, holding them back. And then the woman came, Mary, and she said, "Let them in. No slave is here." And she was telling the truth because to them, slaves didn't exist. They were people, so they were telling the truth. White friends had to assume that a fugitive had no other help in the world and had to bear as a full responsibility as the occasion demanded. When Hannah Gibson, who was also a Quaker, took a weary, sick, and filthy fugitive into her house, she obeyed the sense of Christian love. When she soon fell sick of smallpox, she nursed him for 6 weeks as tenderly as she would her son. To women like Hannah Gibson's, this was loving one's neighbor. Bit by bit, the friends of a runaway found their own usefulness was in proportion to their quick-wittedness, and 9 times out of 10, this meant find a loophole in the law. So, when a devoted anti-slavery lawyer applied himself to a study of state laws, uncanny results followed, and loopholes appeared as though by magic. Isaac Taine Hopper was a perfect example of one of these lawyer friends. For a man such as he, nothing was too daring. He had an imaginative resourcefulness, courage, and sense of humor. He lived in Philadelphia at the turn of the 19th century. Philadelphia was a prowling place of agents of slavery masters. Fugitives and free Negroes were frequently seized by the men and carried, bound over the state border as fast as possible. These outrages became the special concern of friend Hopper. Eventually, he became such a master of the loophole that a slave owner would rather deal with him, with the devil, than Hopper. On one occasion, he was wakened early in the morning and told by a Negro friend that a fugitive had been recaptured by the master and was to be sent out of the state as fast as possible. Hopper dressed hurriedly and ran all the way to the tavern where the fugitive was being held. He pushed aside the landlord, who tried to prevent his entrance, and ran up the stairs to the room where the captive was held. He found the slave bound to a chair and guarded by 6 men. "What are you doing with this man?" he cried almost before he had the door open. The answer fell on him like an avalanche. In less time than he had taken to climb the stairs, he was flying through the open window. He said later that he was so determined on a rescue that he hardly knew what happened to him. His clothes were torn, his body ached, but even while his attackers were congratulating themselves on the way they finished him off forever, he rushed around their front door and darted once more up the stairs. The door was locked. With time pressing so urgently, he ran to the yard again, climbed the roof of a shed by means of high board fence, and forced his way into the adjoining room. His jackknife sprang open when he confronted the slave catchers. He cried, "Let me see if you will get me out so soon again," as he cut ropes that bound the slave, shouting, "Follow me!" He opened the door and dashed down the stairs as fast as he could. The slave was almost as quick as he, but the astonishment of the slave catchers made them slow to take action. By the time they gathered themselves together, Hopper and the slave were halfway down the street. The slave catchers joined a crowd which had quickly formed and chased the 2 men for half a mile, shouting, "Stop, thief!" However, Hopper knew where he was running, and the others did not. He was heading for the office of justice of peace. He was heading straight for a loophole. The justice, with an amazement almost equal to the slave catchers, looked at the bleeding and disheveled Quaker who pushed the slave in before him and slammed the door. "Good heavens, Mr. Hopper," he cried. "What brings you here at this time in the morning in such a trim, with such a rabble at your heels?" Mr. Hopper explained the situation in a few well-chosen words, and the judge burst out laughing. They don't know you as well as we do, friend Hopper," and he agreed to a legal maneuver that protected the fugitive. Isaac Hopper depended on Pennsylvania justice, and it seldom failed him. If the worst came to worst, he could, by one means or another, keep the case of fugitive in the courts for 3 or 4 years. By that time, the claimants were sick of the death of it, and willing to make any settlement. The law posed as an elemental clarity until submitted to begin scrutiny with Mr. Hopper. Then it became a plagued instrument designed exclusively to outwit slave owners. So that's chapter 2. I know it took a long time to read this. I'm sorry, but I had a lot of explaining, a lot of stutters. I don't know. It just takes me a long time to read it out loud, but 16 pages usually would only take a few minutes, because I can read 10 pages in 2 minutes, which is a new achievement that I hit. So woohoo! So it would really only take 3 minutes, but I would have to read really fast. Let's go to a part. This is a story almost unbelievable. Here's in the great daring, told gusto and sincerely. It took through the lives and courageous men and women, some of them known to us by name, most of them unknown. The Underground Railroad maneuvered the escape through Southern slaves to the north. It was carried on at first by a handful of people: Quakers, ministers, farmers, journalists, the escaped slaves themselves. The movement spread, and eventually the network extended to Georgia, to Iowa, from Alabama to California, to Canada. So I can read even faster than that, guys, but that was only half of a page, but still. I can read faster than that if I'm not reading out loud, but, it took me a long time. I just want to say we have some Keiko shirts. We have 3 Keiko shirts, so that's awesome. I'm going to be doing skits tomorrow. Check out my skit channel, my vlog channel, my gaming channel, my reconstruction channel, and that's all the channels I have for now. All right, I love y'all. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.